Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Andersen, author of lovefraud.com and host of the True Love Fraud Stories podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Carla Shohet, an integrative psychologist from the UK, about an extremely important topic, trauma bonding. In our most recent episode, entitled The Trauma Bond is So Real and So Strong, a woman whom we called Sarah knew that she was being abused but could not escape the handsome, controlling, and eventually violent perpetrator. She was addicted to the relationship. Carla explains that Sarah's addiction was a trauma bond. These powerful connections are not just psychological, they are physiological. Carla totally understands how this happens. She herself had a similar experience. Now she uses a blend of the most effective evidence-based therapies to help clients recover from deep-rooted trauma bonds. Here's our conversation. So, can you tell us a bit about your background and your practice?
Yeah, of course, it's my pleasure to. So, I am an integrative trauma psychologist based in the UK, as you can probably hear from my accent, with over 20 years experience in this field. I specialize particularly in helping people to understand how trauma shows up in their bodies, their beliefs, their behaviors, their life. Because like people like Sarah in the episode that I'm here to sort of comment and share psychoeducation on, many of my clients come to me feeling, that sense of shame, feeling confusion, usually after years and years of emotional chaos. They suffer with self-blame or toxic patterns, and I gently guide them to heal at a nervous system level to really recover long term from the effects of complex trauma, which often narcissistic abuse produces in us. And in my work, I blend neuroscience, psychology, attachment based, and somatic practices to really help people heal on a body level, because trauma doesn't just live in our mind, it lives in our body. And I used to run a private practice for many years without kind of including the piece of the body. And then I kind of fell upon my own journey of healing somatically from my own private stuff. And I had to go and dig. And, it's very, very different to how I used to work as a classic talk therapist for many years. Just talking is not enough for trauma, unfortunately.
Okay, so can you describe exactly what you mean by an integrative trauma psychologist?
Yes. So being integrative in this field literally means that well, personally to me, it means that I don't rely on one single approach. Healing trauma is multi-layered, and especially after experiences like Sarah, it requires, as I said earlier, more than just talking, because trauma impacts us on every level, in the mind, cognitively, emotionally, relationally in our relationships, spiritually and physiologically. Our body suffers as well. So I combine evidence-based psychotherapeutic models or modalities that address the whole person. So mind, body, and in particular the nervous system, which is our operating systems as humans. We don't know that, but I try and share as much of this education to clients and whoever will listen to me when I talk, so that I like to take care of all the parts of the client's life holistically, and together we can, look at present challenges. That's when normally a journey starts. Why you are the adult you are, and how are your behaviors, what are the things that you don't like that you would like to change, what's going on for you right now in this present moment. And that's where I normally start. And the reason I work in this integrative way is because, like someone like Sarah, for example, who's experienced deep attachment wounds, developmental trauma, and then highly manipulative relationships, cannot possibly be supported, and have a healing long term in an effective way with just logic. If we could talk or think ourselves out of trauma, we would probably do it very quickly. But, the body does remember what the mind cannot at times, and the brain has a way of kind of hiding things from us, from our consciousness when it's too painful and too much for us to handle. I also offer lots of psychoeducation to really help the survivor understand, what actually happened to them, and how they're operating in a subconscious way, how to grow their nervous system, capacity to be able to handle more in life, and how to regulate their nervous system so that they're not constantly, in these survival shut down or hyperactivated states, always stressed and anxious. And also importantly is, once we've had trauma, because it disconnects us from our true self and our body, I spend a lot of time trying to unlearn old patterns and relearn new ones to really reconnect with your body, your intuition, because it's not woo-woo, it's science. And, so that you can start to really rebuild a sense of self that most of us would have lost through going through a cycle of abuse like we heard Sarah went through.
In the most recent episode of the True Love Fraud Stories, which was called The Trauma Bond is So Real and So Strong, we did tell the story about Sarah, and she describes the trauma bond that she felt with her disordered partner. So, can you explain for our audience what exactly is a trauma bond?
Yes, absolutely. Sarah described it very powerfully, I have to say, in her own words. And first of all, a trauma bond, what I think is one of the biggest misconceptions, is understanding that it's a deeply ingrained physiological and psychological attachment that forms between a victim and their abuser. In a relationship where there is love, which is intertwined with harm, particularly where the relationship involves cycles of basically intermittent reinforcement. So there's love, attention, and affection, and then it's followed by a period of withdrawal, abuse, or some sort of cruelty. It's a trauma bond is not logical; it's physiological. So what that means is that it actually mimics what our nervous system experiences were in possibly early attachment trauma in childhood. So it's not based on love; it's actually based on survival. Because of that reason, it's incredibly powerful and confusing, because the person causing the harm is also the one that the victim's nervous system is literally clinging to for safety. It's a bit like having, an abusive parents. That's where it starts. Whether they are emotionally unavailable or neglectful or just very stressed all the time or inconsistent with their care. Because when you're a child, you absolutely need, an adult caregiver for your survival. So it's almost like a repetition of this pattern in this trauma bond that happens. It feels like it's life or death. And, when Sarah said to, she had begged Tim to come back even after he hurt her, and she felt literally, she said, she felt she couldn't live without him. That's her trauma bond speaking there. And again, it happens when the nervous system begins associating the source of the pain with the source of the comfort. It's this push-pull dynamic, the highs and the lows, the apologies, and then followed by more abuse, and this creates a lot of confusion, and it's an addiction-like hormonal cycle of withdrawals and cravings. It isn't just your mind; it's actually happening on a hormonal level. It really creates this powerful survival-driven need to stay connected, even if it's so unsafe and unhealthy.
Can you emphasize how the trauma bond is formed?
Yes. So basically, it's formed when, abuse is mixed with affection or validation. As I said, it creates that kind of push-pull dynamic that basically is mimicking unresolved childhood patterns. To say it as simply as I can, through the cycles of abuse and intermittent reinforcement of love and attention, and the love bombing stage, and then followed by the discard, and then they come back and apologize. Just like we heard in Sarah's story, Tim kind of alternated between being really charming and attentive to being completely the opposite, the meaning and manipulative and even violent. And this inconsistency literally activates a childlike survival state that says, maybe if I'm better, or maybe if I try harder, or if I'm, just try to be good enough, he'll love me again. And so when Tim came along after offering attention and validation, Sarah's nervous system latched onto it, even if he then turned abusive again.
Why are the trauma bonds so powerful?
Because as I said, it's like it is an addiction. When the brain gets flooded with these stress hormones, like when there is abuse, and you're going through that period where the person isn't nice to you, it literally releases stress hormones in our body like cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and during that abuse phase, you are suffering, you're in pain. But then there is the next phase, which is, the happy phase, where they start to give you attention again. And so then the body starts to release the feel good hormones like serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. And that in that phase, the body's feeling a high. It's literally a biochemical cocktail that creates this addictive loop that makes you trauma bonded. So as I say, it's not emotional; it's actually biological, and the nervous system keeps then chasing that high, that next hit, because that's where it's kind of you're not actually trauma bonded to the person. You're literally trauma bonded to this feel good safety element of that relationship that relationship is providing, even if it's harmful, because as I say, the brain misunderstood that this kind of chaos, because it's familiar, it's safer than being perhaps alone or abandoned or rejected. So actually, Sarah said it herself, didn't she? She said it felt like an addiction, and she wasn't wrong. It is an addiction. It's an addiction that gives us, when we get that kind of high, when we're loved, then you get this temporary relief from the threat of abandonment, which to the system still feels very young. Like if I get abandoned, I'll die, literally. The body just interprets this moment of disconnection when you're being mistreated as dangerous. And for someone like Sarah, who has quite clearly unhealed abandonment wounds from her history of emotional neglect and being rejected and being abandoned by a partner, it's basically is mirroring her deepest fears and needs, right? She needs to feel safe. She needs Tim to feel safe, to feel okay.
When you refer to the nervous system, what do you mean by that?
Thank you for asking that question. I have to clarify. It's the autonomic nervous system I'm referring to. It's basically, our operating system, right? This is what we don't get taught in schools, and we should all be taught from a very young age. And as a psychologist myself for 20 odd years, I didn't know how its role. I was just dealing with people's brains and not actually taking into account the body. And now I just can no longer separate mind and body. It's just one. And the nervous system, when I say it's like an operating system, I mean it. And it's programmed in our childhood by other people, by society, by our family, by the systems that we're in. And it's what operates all involuntary functions in the body, such as your heart beating, your digestive system, your immunity, the hormone releases that we were talking about. It does everything for survival purposes. It helps us to survive. And this is what gets affected when we have early experiences or experience even in adulthood that are hurtful, not because it's not about the event being traumatic, but it's how our nervous system perceives it to be. If we feel unsafe or overwhelmed in a moment that something happens, and this is so easy for children, right? As children, we perceive everything as a threat, and we absolutely need someone adult to keep us, loved and safe and feeling that we matter, so that we can feel like, okay, we're okay. But when there isn't that consistent care, we start to kind of develop patterns within our system, with our nervous system, that are adaptive coping mechanisms as children. So, for example, I don't know if our parents are very stressed all the time because they're working very hard and they're tired, we may become, a really quiet child, or we start taking care of our parents, or we might become the humorous child that starts to make jokes to make, to make the family connect through laughter. Or it could be that we become a really aggressive, naughty child. I'm doing kind of inverted commas with my fingers, which you can't see. All these kind of adaptive patterns that happen so that we can find a way of connecting with the people that we need to connect to and get attention, so that we can feel like, okay, I am actually alive, I'm here, and someone can see me.
In your view, how can a trauma bond be broken?
Oh, very, very gently and slowly. And it has to be done through the body, not just the mind. Breaking a trauma bond is not about, willpower and powering through. It's literally about education, regulation of this nervous system, being able to bring safety back in, and not just kind of being these stuck survival responses of the nervous system, and obviously, ideally, support. But I think the first step is, excuse me, is understanding what a trauma bond actually is, which is what Sarah started to do when her friend, told her about narcissistic abuse and trauma bonding. And, I have an episode on my own podcast specifically about trauma bonding because it's such a big one. And there's a lot of, as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of misconceptions that this is just, weakness. And, in the UK, the statistic currently is that women in domestic violent households leave and come back up to 7 times before leaving, finally, permanently. And that's because of the trauma bond, because it's safer for them to be in a dangerous environment that they're familiar with than to be, not basically. Sometimes when you've been kind of in these cycles of abuse, it's safety and doesn't feel safe to the brain. So we have to teach it. So yeah, first step is psychoeducation. What is the trauma bond? Knowing that you're even, that how you're feeling isn't you being crazy. It's actually your body responding to a very toxic environment. And, when you start to do the work, I would obviously say ideally with the help of a trauma-informed therapist that understands narcissistic abuse and these toxic cycles and has some idea of what the nervous system is all about. And the first piece is the body, restoring safety in the body. You can only do that in somatic practices, really. You can't just learn about it. You also have to embody it and experience it and start to create safety by doing very, very tiny practices to relearn what it is to feel safe. And obviously, to be able to have a therapist that understands this, offers some of that experience already. You need to have lots of corrective experiences over time to be able to kind of show your brain that actually what is new is safe.
I guess the first step you mentioned was the psychoeducation, and the second step would be to start with the somatic practices. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you describe somatic practices? What do you mean by that?
Anything that isn't talk therapy. So because we can talk about the story, we can, understand the story, but understanding and feeling are very different things. So being able to do somatic practices are things that I mentioned, like somatic experiencing and somatic practice or Feldenkrais, literally using the body. How it's like learning a new language, let's say. You have to learn the language of the body because the body's always speaking to us from our gut and all our senses. It's constantly trying to communicate to us what is safe, what is not safe. Once we have that psychoeducation and we understand, we can actually do things with our body to rewire the neural pathways that are wired in fear and in all the unhelpful states, and rewire them into very, very healthy states where safety is no longer, and feeling calm, for example. A lot of people struggle with practices like meditation or yoga, for example, because slowing down and just being with our thoughts, being with our sensations, more importantly, can be really, really scary. It can be, and the body will just, the brain will just dissociate us and not let us feel, These are both survival strategies that we, automatically developed to cope, but also taught to us, men don't cry, for example, or, in England, we have keep calm and carry on. Just ignore all your feelings and just keep living on. So it's about learning to feel the body on from the inside, and also learning to be present with, you can relearn to have a secure attachment with nature, for example, to feel to learn safety and what it feels like. And it's about learning this aspect of being able to feel that it's safe, because when we can do that, that's when we can then go, when we've got the capacity to literally feel that we are sweating or shaking, or that our head is hot because we're really, really angry because someone's crossed our boundary, and we can feel that rather than suppress it and go, oh no, I'm fine, everything's okay, and kind of bottle it up and suppress it. And that's, long term, that accumulates and makes us physically ill.
Well, let's talk about a few of these things, a few of the strategies that you work with. Well, first of all, you mentioned polyvagal theory. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so polyvagal theory is an underpinning of how I work in my clinical practice and in my programs. It helps us to literally understand how our body responds to danger, safety, and connection. So it literally, with this information, this psychoeducation really helps the client or all of us really map these responses. And then we go in gently once we have the awareness, because without awareness, we can't do anything, right? That's the first step. Once we know what happens in, a safe state of connection, which is called ventral vagal, or a sympathetic fight flight state where we respond to danger by either wanting to fight back with anger and, react with outbursts and project maybe sometimes and shout, or anxiety where we are constantly kind of feeling afraid, or whether we're responding by going into a dorsal vagal shutdown, which is where depression, of sometimes suicidality, and these kind of very low energy. This is a metabolic shutdown that happens in the body. So once we can understand, how these autonomic responses happen in our own individual bodies, and we see them as reactions, not as personality flaws like I'm lazy or I'm always angry, that they're actually brilliant adaptive strategies. They're just, maladaptive now because we're not children anymore. So once we understand that, we can start to help the system to shift out of being stuck in these two survival states. Predominantly, the kind of fight flight is what we see in survivors, that kind of anger, anxious state.
So then you mentioned IFS.
Yes.
What is that?
IFS stands for Internal Family Systems, and it's a model created by Richard Schwartz, or Dick Schwartz, as is now known. It's become more and more popular over the years. And basically, this modality helps us to see ourselves as different parts. So probably using Sarah as an example, there was a part of her that begged Tim to come back, even though there was other parts of her that just wanted her to run away. So it helps us to understand, really compassionately how we as individuals, and also when we see when we see the people in general from a lens of IFS, it's beautiful because it's very, very compassionate, and we can reconnect with these parts without judging them.
So IFS isn't about your whole family of origin. It's about just yourself.
Yes. And there are parts of us, they're parts of us, individual, but some parts could be also developed from, generational burdens that some of the parts carry. So then they actually don't belong to us at all, but they are mirrored through, our parents or even before. And, the beautiful thing about IFS for someone like me who's an integrative therapist is that you can integrate it with lots of different other modalities. I integrate it with brain spotting, and we do, part spotting as well, using eye positioning to access and release trauma stored deep in the brain that is, beyond language and beyond, explicit memory. So it's a body memory, implicit procedural memory, but we can't remember it with a visual.
And you just mentioned brain spotting. What does that mean?
So brain spotting is, of course, I love all the therapies that I use, otherwise I wouldn't be using them. But I'm a huge, huge advocate for brain spotting because, as I've been saying, trauma cannot be healed just by talking about it. And sometimes that can actually just re-traumatize us. And brain spotting, I could do a session for 90 minutes or 60 minutes with someone and not say one single word. And the reason for that is because brain spotting is reliant on using eye position it uses basically the optical nerve, travels right through all the different parts of our brain, right into the brainstem, which is the most primitive part, and accesses the body. Because when I say that trauma lives in the body, I actually mean it in a biological sense. When we have these incomplete stress responses, so when something really stressful and overwhelming happens to us, and our body doesn't have the capacity to kind of process it to its completion and release that stress, those hormones that have been released to help us either fight the danger or run away from the danger, they literally stay stuck in our body, in our fascia. And what happens with brain spotting is that almost like the optical nerves and the eye positioning serves almost like a laser, if you can imagine it, going right through all the different parts of the brain, straight into a part of the body, and the body wants to heal. So it's very body-led and client-led, and it just literally goes and almost like arrows for a trauma, what they call a trauma capsule, where there is this kind of, either chronic or single event, overwhelming stress, hormones that got stuck in the fascia in a part of the body. And it can, by just focusing on the sensations that come up because of that eye position, that can actually either be followed naturally or the practitioner can help you to find. And you start to feel an activation in your body. So it's very, very somatic.
So we kind of mentioned different somatic practices. So could you describe one of them and how it works and what a client actually does?
Say, for example, there is a client that's presenting with a lot of anger, but they're just not able to feel it. They're only able to talk about it. Oh, I'm angry and, I react like this. Then I might teach them a somatic technique of, being able to intentionally feel their anger in a titrated way, meaning, in a way that doesn't overwhelm them. So it could be just kind of getting a towel and squeezing by putting all their kind of upper arm body strength into this towel, and maybe leading them to kind of sensing from within if there is the beginning of like a grin or a growl that's starting to happen, and helping them to kind of feel their way through that until it's just enough, and not too much. Or it could be pushing against the wall in a specific, it's quite difficult without a video to explain, but kind of placing your hands against the wall and trying to push something that makes you feel really angry that you can't express for whatever reason. Because a lot of us have been taught, for example, that anger is not okay to express, and anger makes you bad. And so a lot of people that come to me from relationships where they've had to kind of silence their feelings and suppress them, they really struggle to go there and allow that kind of fight flight energy that couldn't, or it could be just kind of going through the somatic, slowing down the process of, slamming a door, and doing that super, super slowly until, because it gives that very slowed down movement, gives, when connected to the experience, is basically what the body needed to do at the time of something stressful happen. Maybe you wanted to run away and you couldn't run away from a situation, and the body's constantly trying to complete that stress response cycle, and it can't because you just didn't have the opportunity to slam the door like you wanted to, or slap someone. I'm not suggesting you go slapping people, but I'm just saying, we can go back to finish the processes that at the time we couldn't for whatever reason, and slow them right down so the body has time and space to integrate.
So I had an experience, and maybe this qualifies. You can tell me, because I was married to a guy who was later clinically diagnosed as a psychopath. But luckily, he wasn't violent, but he did wipe me out financially. And I had a lot of anger. And so what I found helped me was envisioning his face in a pillow and beating it until I collapsed. So is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that could be one as well. As long as you were connecting to the somatic experience, which is the feelings in your body as well, that would make it a somatic practice. And that is one of the things that I do with my clients as one of the somatic experiencing exercises.
So here's my last question then. What words of advice and encouragement do you have for people who've felt trauma bonded to disordered partners?
The first thing I want to say is that you are not crazy and you're not weak. And also you're not broken. Okay, you are responding the way any human would if their core needs for love and safety were exploited, which is what happens within those relationships. And like Sarah said so clearly, you can end up feeling like a shell of yourself. But I want you to know that that doesn't actually mean you're lost. Okay, there's this like a little flame still burning inside all of the time. Our potential for our survival mechanism, our beautiful nervous system, is always working for us. There are no bad parts of us. There are no bad parts of our nervous system. It's always operating for us, our survival. So you are still in there somewhere. It just means that you've been in survival mode for far too long, and you either have not had, you've had neglect for too long, or you've not had enough love for too long. And, you know, the other thing is, a lot of the time people healing from trauma bonds are shamed, and that's really, really dangerous because it can drive the pain underground. And that's, I just want to say that, trauma bond isn't about necessarily cutting off the parts of you that went through that. It's the opposite. It's about welcoming them home, understanding that there is hope, there is healing out there, and it's not your fault, and that you are absolutely, deserving and worthy of peace and love and harmony and a life that doesn't require you to suffer in order to feel seen.
That was fabulous, Carla. A really, really wonderful summary and encouraging for people who are listening and may have found themselves in this situation. So I want to thank you for your time. This was a fabulous interview, very informative, and I appreciate you being willing to share your expertise.
Thank you so much for having me on, Donna. I really appreciate your work.
I'm Donna Andersen, and this is True Love Fraud Stories. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Carla Shohet. For information about her therapeutic approach, please visit carlashohet.com. You'll find a link on the page about this interview on podcasts.lovefraud.com. True Love Fraud Stories is produced by lovefraud.com. Engineering is by Terry Kelly. To learn how to recognize and recover from everyday sociopaths, visit lovefraud.com. You'll find articles, books, and webinars. You can also make an appointment with me, Donna Andersen, for advice on how to recover from your personal experience with a disordered individual. I help you to put down the emotional burden, feel better, and move forward. Book your session today at lovefraud.com/talk to Donna. Also, I invite you to my Love Fraud Live YouTube show. I talk about how to spot, escape, and recover from sociopaths, and then I answer your questions. It streams live every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I look forward to seeing you there.